Welcome to Wicked Shizuku's Reviews, bringing you a southern perspective on books, movies, music, and much, much more. Stick around for a while, you just might hear something wicked. Hello again, friends. Lovely to see you again. So, today is Tuesday, December 13th, and if you've tuned in before, you knew that I was expecting an upcoming CT scan, and I went and I had that this morning. That was a very interesting experience, I'll tell you what. But it went all right, and I should be getting results in soon. Coming in on that. And I'm going to do a light episode tonight, and you'll be able to find episode 15 and 16 over on YouTube uploaded. But tonight, I'm going to go ahead and carry on with a Tuesday read. And we shall also be joined by our little cat, Teddy, over here. So, I might be a little distracted tonight. So, I'm going to skip Eothen on this episode. So, if you're looking for Eothen, we'll continue next time with that, since I skipped finishing out Christopher Columbus last Tuesday. But I'm going to carry on with the Book of Brave Deeds. And this one is titled The Rock of the Capital. And it was taken from a Book of Golden Deeds by C.M. Young. Okay. The city of Rome was gradually rising on the banks of the Tiber, and every year was adding to its temples and public buildings. Every citizen loved his city and her greatness above all else. There was, as yet, little wealth among them. The richest owned little more than a few acres, which they cultivated themselves by the help of their families, and sometimes of a few slaves. And the beautiful Campagna di Roma, girt in by hills looking like amethysts in the distance, had not then become almost uninhabitable from pestilential air, but was rich and fertile, full of highly cultivated small farms, where corn was raised in furrows made by a small hand plow, and herds of sheep, goats, and oxen browsed in the pasture lands. The owners of these lands would not on public days take off their rude working dress and broad-brimmed straw hat, and putting on the white toga with a purple hem, would enter the city and go to the valley called the Forum, or marketplace, to give their votes for the officers of state who were elected every year. especially the two consuls, who were like kings, all but the crown, wore purple togas richly embroidered, sat on ivory chairs, and were followed by lictors carrying an axe and a bundle of rods for the execution of justice. In their own chamber sat the Senate, the great council composed of the patricians or citizens of highest birth and of those who had formerly been consuls. They decided on peace or war and made the laws and were the real governors of the state, and their grave dignity made great impression on all who came near them. Above the buildings of the city rose steep and high the Capitoline Hill, with the temple of Jupiter on its summit, and the strong wall in which was the chief stronghold and citadel of Rome, the capital, the very center of her strength and resolution. When a war was decided on, every citizen capable of bearing arms was called into the forum, bringing his helmet, breastplate, short sword, and heavy spear, and the officers, called tribunes, chose out a sufficient number who were formed into bodies called legions, and marched to battle under the command of one of the consuls. Many little states or Italian tribes who had nearly the same customs as Rome surrounded the Campania, and so many disputes arose that every year, as soon as the crops were saved, the armies marched out. The flocks were driven to folds on the hills. The women and children were placed in the walled cities, and a battle was fought, sometimes followed up by the siege of the city of the defeated. The Romans did not always obtain the victory, but there was a staunchness about them that was sure to prevail in the long run. If beaten one year, they came back to the charge the next, and thus they gradually mastered one of their neighbors after another, and spread their dominion over the central part of Italy. They were well used to Italian and Etruscan ways of making war, but after nearly 400 years of this kind of fighting, a stranger and wilder enemy came upon them. These were the Gauls, a tall, strong, brave people, long-limbed and red-haired, of the same race as the Highlanders of Scotland. They had gradually spread themselves over the middle of Europe, and had for some generations past lived among the Alpine mountains, whence they used to come down upon the rich plains of northern Italy for forays, in which they slew and burnt and drove off cattle, and now and then, when a country was quite depopulated, would settle themselves in it. And thus, the Gauls conquering from the north and the Romans from the south, these two fierce nations at length came against one another. The old Roman story is that it happened thus. The Gauls had an unusually able leader, whom Latin historians call Brennus, but whose real name was most likely Bran, and who is said to have come out of Britain. He had brought a great host of Gauls to attack Clusium, a Tuscan city, and the inhabitants sent to Rome to entreat succor. 3 ambassadors, brothers of the noble old family of Fabius, were sent from Rome to intercede for the Clusians. They asked Brennus what harm the men of Clusium had done the Gauls, that they thus made war on them. And according to Plutarch's account, Brennus made the answer that the injury was that the Clusians possessed land that the Gauls wanted, remarking that it was exactly the way in which the Romans themselves treated their neighbors, adding, however, that this was neither cruel nor unjust, but according to the good old plan that they should take who have the power, and that they should keep who can. Footnote: these lines of Wordsworth's on Rob Roy's grave almost literally translate the speech of Plutarch gives, the first Celt of history, Brennus. The Fabii, on receiving this answer, were so foolish as to transgress the rule owned even by the savage Gauls, that an ambassador would neither fight nor be fought with. They joined the Clusians, and one brother named Quintus killed a remarkably large and tall Gallic chief in single combat. Brennus was unjustly enraged and sent messengers to Rome to demand that the brothers should be given to him for punishment. The priests and many of the Senate held that the rash young men had deserved death as covenant breakers, but their father made strong interest for them and prevailed not only to have them spared, but even chosen as tribunes to lead the legions in the war that was expected. Footnote: these events happened during an experiment made by the Romans of having 6 military tribunes instead of consuls. Thus, he persuaded the whole nation to take on itself the guilt of his sons, a want of true self-devotion uncommon among the old Romans, and which was so severely punished. The Gauls were much enraged and hurried southwards, not waiting for plunder by the way, but declaring that they were friends to every state save Rome. The Romans, on their side, collected their troops in haste, but with a lurking sense of having transgressed, and since they had gainsaid the counsel of their priests, they durst not have recourse to the sacrifices and ceremonies by which they usually sought to gain the favor of their gods. Even among heathens, the saying has often been verified: a sinful heart makes failing hand. And the battle on the banks of the river Allia, about 11 miles from Rome, was not so much a fight as a rout. The Roman soldiers were ill drawn up and were at once broken. Some fled to Veii, and other towns. Many were drowned in crossing the Tiber, and it was but a few who showed in Rome their shame-stricken faces and brought word that the Gauls were upon them. Had the Gauls been really in pursuit, the Roman name and nation would have perished under their swords, but they spent 3 days in feasting and sharing their plunder, and thus gave the Romans time to take measures for the safety of such as yet escape. There seems to have been no notion of defending the city. The soldiers had been too much dispersed, but all who still remained and could call up something of their ordinary courage carried all the provisions they could collect into the stronghold of the capital, and resolved to hold out there till the last, in hopes that the scattered army might muster again, or that the Gauls might retreat after having revenged themselves on the city. Everyone who could not fight took flight, taking with them all that they could carry, and among them went the white-clad troop of the Vestal Virgins, carrying with them their censer of fire, which was esteemed sacred and never allowed to be extinguished. A man named Albinius, who saw these sacred women footsore, weary, and weighed down with the treasures of their temple, removed his own family and goods from his cart and seated them in it, an act of reverence for which he was much esteemed, and thus they safely reached the city of Cumae, or Cumae. The only persons left in Rome outside the capital were 80 of the oldest senators and some of the priests. Some too were too feeble to fly, and would not come into the capital to consume the food that might maintain fighting men. But most of them were filled with a deep, solemn thought that by offering themselves to the weapons of the barbarians, they might atone for the sin sanctioned by the Republic, and that their death might be the saving of the nation. This notion that the death of a ruler would expiate a country's guilt was one of the strange presages abroad in the heathen world of that which alone takes away the sin of all mankind. On came the Gauls at last. The gates stood open. The streets were silent. The houses, low-browed doors showed no one in the paved courts. No living man was to be seen, till at last, hurrying down the steep, empty streets, they reached the great open space of the Forum, and there they stood, still in amazement, for ranged along a gallery was a row of ivory chairs, and in each chair sat the figure of a white-haired, white-bearded man with arms and legs bare, and robes either of snowy white, bordered with purple, or purple richly embroidered, ivory staves in their hands, and majestic, unmoved countenances. So motionless were they, that the Gauls stood still, not knowing whether they beheld men or statues. A wondrous scene it must have been, as the brawny, red-haired Gauls, with freckled visage, keen little eyes, long broad sword, and wide plaid garment, fashioned into loose trousers, came curiously down into the marketplace one after another. Let me show you illustration. And the illustration is captioned with "stood silent and transfixed at the spectacle of this grand figure." And each stood silent and transfixed at the spectacle of those grand figures, still unmoving, save that their large, full liquid dark eyes showed them to be living beings. Surely these Gauls deemed themselves in the presence of that council of kings, who were sometimes supposed to govern Rome. Nay, if they were not before the gods themselves, at last one Gaul, ruder or more curious than the rest, came up to one of the venerable figures, and to make proof whether he were flesh and blood, stroked his beard. Such an insult from an uncouth barbarian was more than a Roman blood could brook. And the Gaul soon had his doubt satisfied by a sharp blow on the head from the ivory staff. all reverence was dispelled by that stroke. It was at once returned by a death thrust, and the fury of the savages wakening in proportion to the awe that had at first struck them, they rushed on the old senators and slew each one in his curule chair. Then they dispersed through the city, burning, plundering, and destroying. To take the capital they soon found to be beyond their power, but they hoped to starve the defenders out. And in the meantime they spent their time in pulling down the outer walls and such houses and temples as had resisted the fire, till the defenders of the capital looked down from their height on nothing but desolate black burnt ground, with a few heaps of ruins in the midst, and the barbarians roaming about in it, and driving in the cattle that their foraging parties collected from the country round. There was much earnest faith in their own religion among the Romans. They took all this ruin as the just reward of their shelter of the Fabii. And even in their extremity were resolved not to transgress any sacred rule. Though food daily became more scarce and starvation was fast approaching, not one of the sacred geese that were kept in Juno's temple was touched, and one Fabius Dorso, who believed that the household gods of his family required a yearly sacrifice on their own festal day. On the Quirinal Hill, arrayed himself in the white robes of a sacrificer, took his sacred images in his arms, and went out of the capital, through the midst of the enemy, through the ruins to the accustomed altar, and there performed the regular rites. The Gauls, seeing that it was a religious ceremony, let him pass through them untouched, and he returned in safety. But Brennus was resolved on completing his conquest, and while half of his forces went out to plunder, he remained with the other half, watching the moment to effect an entrance into the capital. And how were the defenders, worn out with hunger, to resist without relief from without? And who was there to bring relief to them, who were themselves the Roman state and government? Now there was a citizen named Marcus Furius Camillus, who was without question at that time the first soldier of Rome, and had taken several of the chief Italian cities, especially that of Veii, which had long been a most dangerous enemy. But he was a proud, haughty man, and had brought on himself much dislike, until at last a false accusation was brought against him, that he was taking an unfair share of the plunder of Veii. He was too proud to stand a trial, and leaving the city, He was too proud to stand trial, and leaving the city, was immediately fined a considerable sum. He had taken up his abode at the city of Ardea, and was there living when the plundering half of Brennus's army was reported to coming thither. Camillus, immediately offering the magistrates to undertake their defense, and getting together all the men who would bear arms. He led them out, fell upon the Gauls as they all lay asleep and unguarded in the dead of night, made a great slaughter of them, and saved Ardea. All this was heard by the many Romans who had been living dispersed since the rout of Aelia, and they began to recover heart and spirit, and to think. Hold on one moment. Okay, sorry. Let's see. By the many Romans who had been living dispersed since the rout of Aelia, and they began to recover heart and spirit, and to think that if Camillus or Camillus would be their leader, they might yet do something to redeem the honor of Rome and save their friends in the capital. An entreaty was sent to him to take the command of them. But like a proud, stern man he was, he made answer that he was a mere exile and could not take upon himself to lead Romans without a decree from the Senate giving him authority. The Senate was, all that remained of it, shut up in the capital. The Gauls were spread all around. How was that decree to be obtained? A young man named Pontius Cominius undertook the desperate mission. He put on a peasant dress and hid some corks under it, supposing that he could find no passage by the bridge over the Tiber. Traveling all day on foot, he came at night to the bank and saw the guard at the bridge. Then, having waited for darkness, he rolled his one thin light garment with the corks wrapped up in it round his head, and trusted himself to the stream of the Father Tiber, like good Horatius before him, and he was safely borne along to the foot of the Capitoline hill. He crept along, avoiding every place where he saw lights or heard noise, till he came to a rugged precipice, which he suspected would not be watched by the enemy, who would suppose it too steep to be climbed from above or below. But the resolute man did not fear the giddy, dangerous ascent. Even in the darkness, he swung himself up by the stems and boughs of vines and climbing plants. His naked feet clung to the rocks and tufts of grass, and at length he stood on the top of the rampart, calling out his name to the soldiers who came in haste around him, not knowing whether he was friend or foe. A joyful sound must his Latin speech have been to the long-tried, half-starved garrison, who had not seen a fresh face for 6 long months. The few who represented the Senate and people of Rome were hastily awakened from their sleep and gathered together to hear tidings brought to them at so much risk. Pontius told them of the victory at Ardea, and that Camillus and the Romans collected at Veii were only waiting to march to their succor till they should give him lawful power to take the command. There was little debate. The vote was passed at once to make Camillus dictator, an office to which Romans were elected upon great emergencies, and which gave them for time absolute kingly control. And then Pontius, bearing the appointment set off once again upon his mission, still under the shelter of night, clambered down the rock, and crossed the Gallic camp before the barbarians were yet awake. There was hope in the little garrison, but danger was not over. The sharp-eyed Gauls observed that the shrubs and creepers were broken, the moss frayed, and fresh stones and earth rolled down at the crag of the capital. They were sure that the rock had been climbed, and therefore that it might be climbed again. Should they, who were used to the snowy peaks, dark abysses, and huge glaciers of the Alps, were afraid to climb where a soft dweller in a tame Italian town could venture a passage. Brennus chose out the hardest of his mountaineers and directed them to climb up in the dead of night, one by one, in perfect silence. One moment. Okay. And thus to surprise the Romans and complete the slaughter and victory before the forces assembling at Veii could come to their rescue. Silently, the Gauls... Teddy's misbehaving. Do forgive her. Silently, the Gauls climbed so stilly that not even a dog heard them. One moment. I will be right back. Okay, sorry about that. It's one of the reasons that we call Teddy the shitty princess is that she's quite shitty and she likes to try to go everywhere. And she refuses to go to the box. And I can't figure out why. So please do excuse Teddy, the shitty princess, and we will get back into reading The Rock of the Capital. Alright. So, where did I leave off? Silently, the Gauls climbed so stilly that not even a dog heard them, and the sentinel nearest to the post, who had fallen into a dead sleep of exhaustion from hunger, never awoke. But the fatal stillness was suddenly broken by loud gabbling, cackling, and flapping of heavy wings. The sacred geese of Juno, which had been so religiously spared in the famine, were frightened by the rustling beneath, and proclaimed their terror in their own noisy fashion. The first to take alarm was Marcus Manlius, who started forward just in time to meet the foremost climbers as they set foot on the rampart. One who raised an axe to strike lost his arm by one stroke of Manlius's short Roman sword. The next was by main strength hurled backwards over the precipice, and Manlius stood alone on the top for a few moments, ready to strike the next who should struggle up. The whole of the garrison were in a few moments on the alert, and the attack was entirely repulsed. The sleeping sentry was cast headlong down the rock, and Manlius was brought by each grateful soldier that which was then most valuable to all, a little meal and a small measure of wine. Still, the condition of the capital was lamentable. There was no certainty that Pontius had ever reached Camillus in safety, and indeed the discovery of his path by the enemy would rather have led to the supposition that he had been seized and detected. The best hope lay in wearying out the besiegers, and there seemed to be more chance of this, since the Gauls often could be seen from the heights, burying the corpses of their dead. Their tall, bony forms looked gaunt and drooping, and here and there unburied carcasses lay amongst the ruins. Nor were the flocks and herds any longer driven in from the country. Either all must have been exhausted, or else Camillus and his friends must be near and preventing their raids. At any rate, it appeared as if the enemy was quite as ill off as to provisions as the garrison, and in worse condition as to health. In effect, this was the first example of the famous saying that Rome destroys her conquerors. In this state of things, one of the Romans had a dream that Jupiter, the special god of the capital, appeared to him and gave the strange advice that all the remaining flour should be baked and the loaves thrown down into the enemy's camp, telling the dream, which may perhaps have been the shaping of his own thoughts, that this apparent waste would persuade the barbarians that the garrison could not soon be starved out. This person obtained the consent of the rest of the besieged. Some approved the stratagem, and no one chose to act contrary to Jupiter's supposed advice. So the bread was baked and tossed down by the hungry men. After a time, there was a report from the other guards that the Gallic watch had been telling them that their leader would be willing to speak with some of the Roman chiefs. Accordingly, Sulpicius, one of the tribunes, went out and had conference with Brennus, who declared that he would depart, provided the Romans would lay down a ransom for their capital and their own lives of 1,000 pounds weight of gold. To this, Sulpicius agreed, and returning to the capital, the gold was collected from the treasury and carried down to meet the Gauls, who brought their own weights. The weights did not meet the amount of gold ornaments that had been contributed for the purpose, and no doubt the Gauls were resolved to have all that they beheld. For when Sulpicius was about to try to arrange the balance, Brennus insultingly threw his sword into his own scale, exclaiming, "Vae victis, woe to the conquered." The Roman was not yet fallen so low as not to remonstrate. The dispute was waxing sharp when there was a confused outcry in the Gallic camp, a shout from the heights of the capital, and into the midst of the open space rode a band of Roman patricians and knights in armor, with the dictator Camillus at their head. He no sooner saw what was passing than he commanded the treasure to be taken back, and turning to Brennus, said, "It is with iron, not gold, that Romans guard their country." Brennus declared that the treaty had been sworn to, and that it would be a breach of faith to deprive him of the ransom, to which Camillus replied that he himself was a dictator, and no one had the power to make a treaty in his absence. The dispute was so hot that they drew their swords against one another, and there was a skirmish amongst the ruins. But the Gauls soon fell back and retreated to their camp when they saw the main body of Camillus's army marching upon them. It was no less than 40,000 in number, and Brennus knew that he could not withstand them with his broken, sickly army. He drew off the next morning, but was followed by Camillus and routed with great slaughter about 8 miles from Rome, and very few of the Gauls lived to return home, for those who were not slain in battle were cut off in their flight by the country people whom they had plundered. In reward for their conduct on this occasion, Camillus was termed Romulus, father of his country, and second founder of Rome. Marcus Manlius received the honorable surname of Capitolinus, and even the geese were honored by having a golden image raised to their honor in Juno's temple, and a live goose was yearly carried in triumph upon a soft litter in a golden cage, as long as any heathen festivals lasted. The reward of Pontius Cominius does not appear, but surely he and the old senators who died for their country's sake deserve to be forever remembered for their brave contempt of life when a service could be done to the state. The truth of the whole narrative is greatly doubted, and it is suspected that the Gallic conquest was more complete than the Romans ever chose to avow. Their history is far from clear up to this very epoch, when it is said that all their records were destroyed. But even when place and period are misty, great names and the main outline of their actions loom through the cloud, perhaps exaggerated, but still with some reality. And if the magnificent romance of the sack of Rome be not fact, yet it is certainly history, and well worthy of note and remembrance as one of the finest extant traditions of the whole chain of golden deeds. That is the Rock of the Capital. And next time we visit this particular book, we will be continuing with the Keys of Callias. So, moving on with our Tuesday reads, we have The Outline of History by H.G. Wells. All of the cats decide that they want to be naughty tonight. Silly cats. All right, so continuing. All right. The Outline of History, Book 1, The World Before Man. 1. The Earth in Space and Time. 1. The Great Expansion of Men's Ideas of Space and Time. And first, before we begin the history of life, let us tell something of the stage upon which our drama is put, and of the background against which it is played. In the last few hundred years, there has been an extraordinary enlargement of men's ideas about the visible universe in which they live. At the same time, there has been perhaps a certain diminution in their individual self-importance. They have learnt that they are items in a whole far vaster, more enduring, and more wonderful than their ancestors ever dreamed or suspected. To the savage and primitive mind, the earth seems to be the whole flat floor of the universe. The sky is a dome above it, across which the sun and moon and stars pass and pass again, returning by some mysterious roundabout or subterranean route. The Babylonian and Chinese astronomers, after many centuries of star observation, still believed that the earth was flat. It was the Greek mind which first grasped clearly the spherical form of the world, but even so, it did not apprehend the universe as relatively very large. The globe of earth was the center of being. The sun, the moon, the planets, the fixed stars moved about it as their center in crystalline spheres. It was only in the 15th century that men's minds moved beyond this, and Copernicus made his amazing guess that the sun was the center and not the earth. It was only with the development of the telescope by Galileo in the opening of the 17th century that the views of Copernicus became widely accepted. The development of the telescope marks, indeed, a new phase in human thought and new vision of life. It is an extraordinary thing that the Greeks, with their lively and penetrating minds, never realized the possibilities of either microscope or telescope. They made no use of the lens, yet they lived in the world in which glass had been known and had been made beautiful for hundreds of years. They had about them glass flasks and bottles through which they must have caught glimpses of things distorted and enlarged. But science in Greece was perused by philosophers in an aristocratic spirit, men who, with a few such exceptions as the ingenious Archimedes and Hero, were too proud to learn from such mere artisans as jewelers and metal and glass workers. Ignorance is the first penalty of pride. The philosopher had no mechanical skill and the artisan had no philosophical education, and it was left for another age, more than 1,000 years later, to bring together glass and astronomer. Since the time of Galileo, astronomy and the telescope have advanced together, and a veil of ignorance and false assumptions has been rolled back from the deeps of space. The idea that the sun was the center of the universe has followed the idea that the world was in that position. We know now that our sun cannot even be included among the greatest of the stars. It is merely one of the lesser lights. The telescope has released the human imagination, and as no other implement has ever done. If there is any other apparatus worthy to be compared to its discoveries of the Fraunhofer, the glass worker, in 1814, since man has lived on earth, he has seen rainbows. But who could have told him that those bands of color held in them a promise that one day he should be able to analyze the stars? But the spectroscope receives the rays from any luminous source, passes them through prisms, and breaks them up into rainbow-like bands. These bands reveal under examination traverse lines of brightness and darkness, which vary with the heat and the chemical composition of the source of light and of any intervening vapor, so that men can now sit in observatories and learn the composition and take the temperature of stars incalculable billions of miles away. The curtain that hid the unfathomable abyss of stellar distances has been drawn back only in the last 3 centuries. Still more recent is our realization of the immense duration of our universe in time. Among ancient peoples, the Indian philosophers alone seem to have had any perception of the vast ages through which existence has passed. In the European world, until little more than a century and a half ago, men's ideas of the time things had lasted were astonishingly brief. In the Universal History, published by a syndicate of booksellers in London in 1779, it is stated that the world was created in 4004 BC, and with pleasant exactitude. At the autumnal equinox, and that the making of man crowned the work of creation at Eden upon the Euphrates, exactly 2 days' journey above Basra. The confidence of these statements arose from too literal interpretation of the Bible narrative. Very few, even of the sincerest believers in inspiration of Bible, now accept them as matter-of-fact statements. It is the science of geology, and particularly the science of paleontology, which has broken through this time barrier and opened beyond that little yesterday of scarcely 6,000 years. A million such yesterdays. 2 main sets of facts, very frequently observed, were forcing themselves upon men's attention long before the 18th century. One was that in innumerable districts, one saw exposed great thickness of stratified rock that could only have been accumulated during long periods of time, and that in many cases these strata have been bent, contorted, and thus about a way that was inevitably suggestive of enormous forces operating through long periods of time. The other was the existence of fossils similar to, but not precisely like, the bones and skulls of other hard parts of existing species. It was only the 18th century that the strata and fossils began to be studied systematically. It is only in the 19th and the recognition of real scale and quality of these accumulations, the record of the rocks became widespread. There was a great struggle to establish the authority of the record against the prejudices of those whom a strictly literal interpretation of the Bible was dear. Many men still living took an active part in the great emancipation of humankind. Gradually, the perspectives of mankind changed and elongated. 200 years ago, the imagination of our race had a background of 6,000 years. Now that curtain has risen also, and men look back to the past of scores and hundreds of millions of years. Oh. And 2. The Earth in space. We will now summarize very compactly what is known of the material dimensions of our world. Our Earth, it has been shown, is a spinning globe. Vast though it seems to us, it is a mere speck of matter in the greater vastness of space. Space is, for the most part, emptiness. At great intervals in this emptiness, there are flaring centers of heat and light. The fixed stars, they are all moving about in space, notwithstanding that they are called fixed stars. But for a long time, men did not realize their motion. They are so vast and at such tremendous distances that their motion is not perceived. Only in the course of many thousands of years is it appreciable. Scores of centuries ago, Egyptians made star maps, and they show us that the shapes of the constellations have changed very considerably. Many stars have moved immeasurably, yet we still use old convenient expression fixed stars to distinguish from the planets. These fixed stars are so far off that for all their immensity, they seem to be, even when we look at them through the most powerful telescopes, mere points of light, brighter or less bright. A few, however, when we turn a telescope upon them, are seen to be whirls and clouds of shining vapor, which we call nebulae. They are puffs and smears of luminous stuff, billions of miles in length. They are so far off that a movement of millions of miles could be imperceptible. There are also, it has been realized quite recently, a number of dark bodies in space and cloud of opaque matter, some of enormous size. We should still know nothing of their existence if they had not been a blot out. If it had not been that they blot out the luminous stars beyond them. One star, however, is so near to us that it is like a great ball of flame. This one is the sun. The sun is itself, in its nature, like a fixed star, but it differs from the other stars in appearance because it is beyond comparison nearer than they are. And because it is nearer, men have been able to learn something of its nature. Its mean distance from the Earth is 93 million miles. It is a mass of flaming matter having a diameter of 866,000 miles. Its bulk is 1.25 million times the bulk of our Earth. Many of the fixed stars are vastly greater. These are difficult figures for the imagination. If a bullet fired from A Maxim gun at the sun kept its muzzle velocity unimpaired, it would take 7 years to reach the sun, and yet we say the sun is quite close, measured by the same scale of the stars. If the Earth were a small ball, 1 inch in diameter, the sun would be a globe of 9 feet diameter. It would fill a small bedroom. We know now that it is spinning round on its axis, but since it is an incandescent fluid, its polar regions do not travel with the same velocity as its equator, the surface of which rotates in about 25 days. The surface visible to us consists of clouds of incandescent metallic vapor. So hot is the sun's atmosphere that iron, nickel, copper, and tin are present in it in a gaseous state. At what lies below, we can only guess. About the sun, at great distances, circle not only our Earth, but certain other kindred bodies called the planets. These shine in the sky because they reflect the light of the sun, and they are near enough to us to note their movements quite easily. Night by night, their positions change with regard to the fixed stars. It is well to understand how empty of matter is space. If, as we have said, the sun were a globe 9 feet across, our Earth would, in proportion, be the size of a 1-inch ball, and at a distance of 322 yards from the sun. This is over 1/6 of a mile. It would mean that 3.5 minutes smart walking from the ball to the 9-feet globe. The moon would be a speck of the size of a small pea, 30 inches from the Earth. Nearer to the sun than the Earth would be 2 other very similar specks, the planets Mercury and Venus, at a distance of 124 and 232 yards, respectively. Beyond the Earth would come the planets Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, at distances from the Sun of 488, 1,672, 3,067, 6,169, 9,666, and 13,300 yards, respectively. From the Sun to Neptune would be a 2-hour walk. There would be also a certain number of very much smaller specks flying about amongst these planets, more particularly a number called the asteroids, circling between Mars and Jupiter, and occasionally a little puff of more or less luminous vapor and dust would drift into the system from the almost limitless emptiness beyond. Such a puff is what we call a comet. All the rest of space about us and around us, and for unfathomable distances beyond, is cold, lifeless, and void. The nearest fixed star to us on this minute scale, be it remembered, the Earth is a 1-inch ball, and the moon is a little pea, would be over 40,000 miles away. Most of the fixed stars we see would still be on this scale scores and hundreds of millions of miles off. Let us now come back to the Earth. The diameter of our world is a little under 8,000 miles. Its surface is rough. The more projecting parts of the roughness are mountains, and in the hollows of its surface there is a film of water. the oceans and seas. This film of water is about 5 miles thick at its deepest part. That is to say, the deepest oceans have a depth of 5 miles. This is very little in comparison with the bulk of the world. About this sphere is a thin covering of air, the atmosphere, as we ascend in a balloon or go up a mountain. The air is continually less dense until it becomes too thin to support life. At a height of 20 miles, there is scarcely any air at all. The highest point to which a bird can fly is about 4 miles up. The condor, it is said, can struggle up to that. But most small birds and insects, which are carried up by aeroplanes or balloons, drop off insensible at a much lower level. Balloons with men in them have reached nearly 7 miles, but at the cost of considerable physical suffering. Aeroplanes with pressurized cabins can reproduce the conditions at Earth's surface have flown even higher, and projectiles have carried living things very much further away, but only by carrying an artificial sample of the Earth's atmosphere as well. It is only in the upper few hundred feet of the crust of our Earth in the sea, and in the lower levels of the air below 4 miles, that life naturally occurs. We do not know of any life except in these really very shallow films of air and water upon our planet. So far as we know, all the rest of space is as yet uninhabited. Scientific men have discussed the possibility of life, or of some process of a similar kind, occurring upon such kindred bodies as the planets Venus and Mars, but they point merely to questionable possibilities. 3. How long has the Earth endured? So much for the Earth in space. Let us now consider our subject from the point of view of time. Astronomers and geologists, and those who study physics, are now able to tell us something of the origin of the Earth. The classical theory is that, vast ages ago, the sun was a spinning, flaring mass of matter, not yet concentrated into a compact center of heat and light, considerably larger than it is now, and spinning very much faster, and that as it whirled, a series of fragments were detached from it by the near approach of some other body flying through space, and that those torn off fragments became the planets. Our Earth is one of these planets. The flaring mass that was the material of the Earth broke into 2 masses as it spun, a larger, the Earth itself, and a smaller, which is now the dead still moon. Astronomers give us convincing reasons for supposing that sun and earth and moon and all that system were then whirling about at a speed much greater than their speed today, and that at first our earth was a flaming thing upon which no life could live. They oblige us to believe that the sun, incandescent though it is now much cooler than it was, and that it spins more slowly now than it did, and that it continues to cool and slow down. And they also show that the rate at which the earth spins is diminishing and continues to diminish. That is to say, that our day is growing longer and longer, and that the heat at the center of the earth wastes slowly. There was a time when the day was not a half and not a third of what it is today, when a blazing hot sun, much greater than it is now, must have moved visibly, had there been an eye to mark it. From its rise to its setting across the skies, there will be a time when the day will be long as the year is now, and the cooling sun, shorn of its beams, will hang motionless in the heavens. How long, some readers will ask, has the world endured? That is a question which has attracted much attention in the last few years. Gradually, the earlier estimates, which varied very widely, have been brought towards agreement. Astronomers and mathematicians who base their consumptions on the rate of cooling of celestial bodies and in various processes of diffusion and atomic change give us 2,000 million years as the age of Earth as a body separate from the sun, and about 300 million years as the length of time since life appeared upon it in any abundance. The age of the sun as a star is now supposed to be somewhere in the nature of 5 million years. The Earth, says Sir James Jeans in his Universe Around Us, will in all probability go on for another million years. And then its equatorial temperature may be sinking to Arctic conditions, since man has existed as a self-conscious social creature for only a few tens of thousand years. This gives him the illimitable opportunity for the attainment of knowledge and power. Long before he reaches that limit, he may make himself master of time and space. That was part one. That was very interesting. It's a little wordy, but H.G. Wells has always been quite wordy whenever he is describing things, but he's really pulling out all of the nines here. I mean, it's been a very long time since I've seen, some of the vocabulary that he uses in here, so it's very, very enjoyable to be able to come across new words that you don't see in modernity anymore. So I really enjoyed that, and I hope you did too. So I'm going to take a short break, and I'll be back in a few minutes. See you on the next side. And welcome back. So, continuing on, we'll be picking back up with American literature. And last time we left off in the middle of Christopher Columbus's letters in this particular Norton anthology. And, this letter is an excerpt from the letter to Ferdinand and Isabella regarding the fourth voyage. Let's see. There's a footnote for the title of it, saying the text from the select documents illustrating the four voyages of Columbus, translated and edited by Cecil Jane in 1930 to 1933, written on Jamaica in 1503. This letter was hand-carried from there to Hispaniola by Diego Mendez. It was written in Jamaica, July 7th, 1503. Of Hispaniola Paria. Footnote. Paria was the mainland region of what is now Venezuela, near the island of Trinidad. Columbus, who had first landed in South America, terra firma, as he terms it later, in 1498, argued that the terrestrial paradise lay nearby. Of Hispaniola, Paria, and other lands, I think without weeping. I believed that their example would have been to profit of others. On the contrary, they are in an exhausted state, although they are not dead. The infirmity is innumerable, or very extensive. Let him who brought them to this state come now with the remedy, if he can, if he knows it, in destruction. Everyone is an adept. It was always the custom to give thanks and promotion to him who imperiled his person. It is not just that he who has been so hostile to this undertaking should enjoy its fruits, or that his children should. Those who left the Indies, flying from the toils and speaking evil of the matter and of me, have returned with official employment. Footnote. Although it appears that Columbus has specific personal enemies in mind, it is not clear whom he means. So it has now been ordained in the case of Verongua, footnote, Panama, where Columbus was shipwrecked earlier in this voyage. It is an example and without profit for the business and for justice in the world. The fear of this, with other sufficient reasons, which I saw clearly, led me to pray your highnesses before I went to discover these islands and terra firma, that you would leave them to me to govern in your royal name. It pleased you, it was a privilege and agreement, and under seal and oath, and you granted me the title of Viceroy and Admiral and Governor General of all, and you fixed the boundary 100 leagues beyond the Azores and the Cape Verde Islands. By a line passing from pole to pole, and you gave me wide power over this and over all, that I might further discover. The document states this very fully. The other most important matter which calls aloud for redress remains inexplicable to this moment. 7 years I was at your royal court, where all to whom this undertaking was mentioned unanimously declared it to be a delusion. Now all, down to the very tailors, seek permission to make discoveries. It can be believed that they go forth to plunder, and it is granted to them to do so, that they greatly prejudice my honor and do very great damage to the enterprise. It is well to give to God that which is his due, and to Caesar that which belongs to him. This is just a sentiment and based on justice. The lands which here obey your highnesses are more extensive and richer than all other Christian lands, after I, by the divine will, have placed them under your royal and exalted lordship, and was on the point of securing a very great revenue. Suddenly, while I was waiting for ships to come to your high presence with victory and with great news of gold, being very secure and joyful, I was made a prisoner, and with my 2 brothers was thrown into a ship laden with fetters, stripped to the skin, very ill treated, and without being tried or condemned. Who will believe that a poor foreigner could in such a place rise against your highnesses without cause and without the support of some other prince, and being alone among your vassals and natural subjects, and having all my children at your royal court? I came to serve at the age of 28 years, and now I have not a hair on my body that is not gray, and my body is infirm, and whatever remained to me from those years of service has been spent and taken away from me and sold, and from my brothers, down to my very coat, without me being heard or seen. To my great dishonor, it must be believed that this was not done by your royal command. The restitution of my honor, the reparation of my losses, and the punishment of him who did this will spread abroad the fame of your royal nobility. The same punishment is due to him who robbed me of these pearls, and to him who infringed my rights as admiral. Footnote. The reference is to Alsano de Ojeda, 1468 to 1516, who had taken pearls, part of what was reserved to Columbus under his agreement with the Spanish crown from Paria to Hispaniola. Very great will your merit, fame without parallel will be yours, if you do this, and there will remain in Spain a glorious memory of your highnesses as grateful and just princes. The pure devotion which I have ever borne to the service of your highnesses, and unmerited wrong that I have suffered, will not permit me to remain silent, although I would fain do so. I pray your highnesses to pardon me. I am so ruined, as I have said. Hitherto I have wept for others, now heaven have mercy upon me, and may the earth weep for me. Of worldly goods I have not even a blanca, footnote, a small Spanish coin, for an offering in spiritual things. Here in the Indies I have become careless of the prescribed forms of religion, alone in my trouble, sick in daily expectation of death, and encompassed about by a million savages, full of cruelty and our foes, and so separated from the holy sacraments of Holy Church. My soul will be forgotten if it here leaves my body. Weep for me, whoever has charity, truth, and justice. I did not sail upon this just voyage to gain honor or wealth. This is certain, for already all hope of that was dead. I came to your highnesses with true devotion and with ready zeal, and I do not lie. I humbly pray, your highnesses, that if it please God to bring me forth from this place, that you will be pleased to permit me to go to Rome and to other places of pilgrimage. May the Holy Trinity preserve your life in high estate, and grant you increase of prosperity. Done in the Indies and in the island of Jamaica on the 7th of July in the year 1503. 1505. That is interesting. I really wonder. At that. But that is the end of the section of Christopher Columbus in American literature. And tonight's episode is concluded for Wicked Shizuku's reviews. And like I said at the beginning of the episode, you shall be able to find episode 15 and 16 uploaded to YouTube in the next couple of days, as I'll be making these up. This is technically episode 17. So let's call it good for this episode. If you have any questions, please email me at wickedshizukus@gmail.com. You can find me on Telegram for announcements every night. And I can also be found on Twitter at Semlin Toll. And that's all for tonight. Thanks for listening. Have a good evening.